In this two-part mini lecture, we're going to take a look at the media. And this is an area in which I have a particular research and fascination, because in today's political environment, more than ever, the media are the gatekeepers. And that's because most people don't interact with other types of political institutions, right? And so if we were in class together, I might say, okay, everybody raise your hand who's been to a party meeting or received flyers from a party, who works for a party. And I think pretty rapidly we'd see we may have a hand or two go up in that circumstance. But if I ask how many people have watched the news, looked at Twitter, anything like that, and I'm going to say most everyone's hand is going to go up. And that fact is indicative of a larger trend, and it has some profound political importance, and that's what we're going to take a look at in this section. Ken Coleman, a wonderful author of some of the textbooks that I use, talks about media this way. He says that media generally refers to the methods of technologies people use for communication. So they're technologies. So media is not people per se, it's the mode of communication. It's the tech that makes different things happen. So it's the television broadcast, it's the Twitter feed. It's all those things that allow people to communicate in different ways. And this has some profound and important impact. Think, for instance, back, for those of you who can remember this far, Howard Dean is running for president, and he has this very unfortunate moment that we now know of as the Dean Scream. I encourage you to pause at this moment, head to YouTube, type in Dean Scream, and see what you see. And you're gonna see he gets all riled up, and all these things are going. And yeah, right, kind of is what he ends up sort of saying. Yeah, and this has been used in memes and memes and memes. And if you've actually went over and taken a look at YouTube, you're gonna see all of the different memes that had and still continue to this day to come out on the Dean Scream. And had there been no broadcast television focused on him at this moment, had this happened in an earlier era, the few people in this room may have thought that was funny. That would have been the end of it. But the Dean Scream will derail Dean's campaign and pretty much end his chances of winning the presidency. And so what we can see is that as media has changed over time, it has fundamentally changed the way that politics has worked over time. And that's a big deal for us. So we have to both understand the technology changes that have occurred to some extent, and we're also going to have to take a look at the press changes. How have the people who use those communication tools done it? So from letters in the 1790s to the cheap daily papers in the late 19th century, to the prominence of television in the 1950s, and now to the internet that begins in the early 1990s and into the 2000s, and now into the new media, we have to understand these things. And there's two major components that I mentioned: mass media and the press. Mass media is information that is going through conduits that it's intended to be publicly available, right? You post something to Twitter, anyone can view it. You broadcast something on CBS, anyone can pick up that transmission. These are media communication tools that are designed to go out to everyone. It's not the private message from one person to another. It's not the letter. It's not an email. It is a technology designed to go from one point out to many, many, many points. That's kind of the broadcast model or the mass media model. The other thing that we're going to have to look at is the press. And the press are the actual people. They're the human beings and the organization structures of those human beings that provide comment across the mass media. Now, we're going to see that this was a whole lot easier once upon a time, but today, normal people can be involved in this process. Social media. But we'll put a pin in that for just a moment and kind of focus on the major eras of the press. And as we go through the major eras of the press, and that's what we're going to finish up with in this mini lecture, we're going to see that there were both technological changes and there were people changes. Now, the first era is the press eras are going to go like this. We're going to take a look at the partisan press. We're going to take a look at the mass circulation. We're going to take a look at the era of progressivism. We're going to take a look at the advent of radio and television. And finally, we're going to examine internet and media, the most recent of the developments in the areas I've already noted that I'm particularly interested in. Now, let's begin with the partisan press era. Early printing in the colonies was not free from governmental control. Printers were only allowed in New England, for instance, if they were licensed by Puritan authorities. And this was just carrying on the same tradition that had happened in Britain, that it was wrong to speak out against government. So this idea that open criticism of government was a positive or even just something that should be allowed was not a concept during this era that many people would have considered. And this era is really going to encompass the colonial period into the first few administrations in early America, or I should say in the United States. Not colonies anymore. And so during the colonial era, printers, we can see, are regularly brought before bars of legislative bodies for all kinds of charges, to answers for affronts, breaches of privilege and prudence and dignity, libels, all of this vast and various things that were considered to be wrong. The other thing that was going to be very different is that colonial printers themselves were not like their modern counterparts that you're thinking of. There was nothing like this pretense of journalistic objectivity that you think about today. That was not the goal. Not at all. Newspapers thought of themselves as trying to bring forth the best possible position for their overt partisan desires, which is why we call this the partisan press era. Because these are newspapers, and these are broadsides, and these are people who are pushing points of view. So the partisan press is going to be marked by a unique interconnection between media, party, and government. Now, this will slowly start to shift as the First Amendment occurs, but even that won't completely end the era, because even after the Revolution, the First Amendment will be famously challenged by the Alien and Sedition Acts, which punished individuals for printing material which was considered to be seditious, or that is, writing or speech against the United States government. So that's going to push for a while, but then eventually there's going to be some major changes, and the major changes are going to eventually lead to what we call the era of mass circulation. And the mass circulation era is primarily going to be defined by technological changes. And what happens is beginning in the 1830s, papers begin to look and reach for the mass public. So while during the era of the partisan press, the production of paper and newspaper was a very, very expensive process, by the 1830s and 40s, the typical cost of a paper was a penny, leading to the rise of what we call the penny press, such as Benjamin Day's New York Sun in '84. And the growth of these, or what we call the mass circulation newspaper, is going to create a press that's a commercialized business. And papers would become big, complex, specialized, and hierarchical. And it was the beginning of the media institution that you're going to be familiar with today. But what happens here is that if you're starting to sell papers for cost, for a penny, how do you make your money? Well, you end up making your money on ads. But how do you sell the most ads? Well, you have to reach big audiences. So you need wide readership. So if I'm selling some good or service, and here's paper one, and it reaches 10,000 people, and here's another paper, and it reaches 10,000 other people, I could negotiate with both, or I could go to a paper that tries to have a wider nonpartisan audience, and maybe have a circulation of 50 or 60 or 70,000 people. And so what will end up changing the newspapers will be advertising pressure. And advertising pressure will push papers to become nonpartisan. So the idea of objectivity doesn't actually come out of some normative goal or some ethical concern of the press, but it rather comes out of a technological change combined with a ad pressure change. This will also lead to what we call today soft news, which was originally called yellow journalism. And yellow journalism is a concept that we're going to talk about more in the next mini lecture, but it was designed about selling ads and selling papers over other things. And I'll give you an example. The idea of yellow even comes from what was called the Yellow Kid. Yes, it's as racist as it looks as it sounds. But it was a hugely popular cartoon in this era, and it was called the Yellow Kid. And it was actually one of the very first kind of rights battle over who had the rights to print this cartoon. And so the printers and the papers who had the rights to print this would actually splash yellow on the yellow blotches on the covers of their papers, so that people who are passing by can know if they buy this paper, well, they're going to get the most recent installment of the Yellow Kid. And actually, at one point in New York, every major newspaper is going to claim the rights to the Yellow Kid. But be that as it may, what happens when you splash some ink on a newspaper is, well, it bleeds all the way through, and so these papers would have yellow all the way through, and people would talk about the idea that the news section was just as entertainment-based as the cartoons, and so yellow journalism was a reference to, newsy content being influenced by what people liked and not what people needed, and today we call that soft news. Now, time will continue to move forward, and there's going to be some big things that happen, and kind of follow along with me on this, and you may actually want to pause this video lecture here and think about a couple of these things, or write it down and maybe listen twice, because I know this is a little bit confusing. Historian Paul Johnson notes that the modern world, what we call the modern world, begins in May 1919. And he says that the modern world begins here because the first substantial proof for the theory of relativity emerges. So that proof gives birth to the modern. Now, here's the confusing part. The modern world is defined by a philosophic system known as postmodernism. Yes, I know. So the era of history is the modern world, but the dominant philosophic view is postmodernity or postmodernism. And really what happened is that the proof of the theory of relativity, one of the things that it shows, lots of things, and we don't need to know all of them, but one of the things we need to know is it showed that the whole old Bohr's orbits model of electrons was false, right? The idea that things move around a nucleus like orbits. And instead, what we've learned is that there's a probability in kind of a dumbbell-looking shape of where an electron might be relative to a neutron core. And what ends up coming out of this is the idea of relativity, the idea that there is no fixed objective truth. So the postmodern, if we just want to sum that up really quickly and easily, says there's no capital T truth. In other words, there's nothing true for everyone, everywhere, all the time. Now, why bother to talk about all this? Well, the problem is that if there is no truth, how do you have objectivity? If you can't have objectivity, how can you be a newspaper that's billed as being objective? This is a huge, huge issue. And it's going to get attempted to be solved by progressivism. Progressivism will push for journalism schools. And these schools will be steeped in a culture that the higher purpose for the press is objectivity. But how do you be objective in a world that has abandoned objectivity? Well, the answer was relatively easy according to progressives. It was that objectivity was submitting information to a process. And the process would create objectivity even if there wasn't capital T absolute truth. And so progressivism would continue to solidify its institutional structure in the media by arguing that stories needed to pass through the press process to be objective. And so the true professional age of the press would be in the 1920s. As progressive writings and that newspaper style that you're now used to became solidified. Now, this is going to get a little overturned and accelerated with the birth of radio and television and the ability to not just read your news, but to experience it by a person who's sitting there with you, right? Now, today, and my mom used to do this, you can have breakfast with the news, right? You get up, you're having your coffee, and there's Good Morning America, and there's Today, and there's all of these shows where you're sitting down with somebody theoretically and having kind of these experiences. And television changes the emotional response that we have. And I want to put a pin in that because in the next lecture we're going to take a look at that. But the big thing that we need to make sure that we understand is that unlike the media that came before it, radio and television are public utilities. And what that means is that they're regulated by the FCC, right? I can print whatever I want under the First Amendment. We talked about this a little bit in the anything I want, but I can print most anything I want under the guise of the First Amendment, and we already took a look at that in the terms of civil liberties. But radio and television comes through broadcast waves. And these waves are doled out and considered to be part of the public's ownership. And so the government, through the FCC, regulates this, and that means they can regulate what comes through it. So if you ever wondered why you don't ever see the F word on broadcast television, that's the FCC. Or why once upon a time, you can't have more, spouses in bed together. Go watch Dick Van Dyke. Hello, FCC. So this is a big change. The newest change is going to come to us courtesy of the internet. And the internet is a very, very new phenomenon. And for most new students, this is going to be weird to think about because you've grown up in this age. But the world that you know is vastly different from the world 20 or 30 years ago. Vast amounts of information can be stored in tiny spaces. I can store more things on my iPhone today than all of the computers combined that my father owned for a campus ministry back when I was tiny. A ColecoVision. As a matter of fact, all of the storage floppy disks that he had together didn't equal even a fraction of what I carry around in my pocket on a day-to-day basis. And the rise of the internet has been solidified by broadband and, most recently important, cell phone networks, which allow you to have speeds that nearly hit broadband with things like 3G and 4G, in terms that you may or may not be a little bit familiar with. To put this in perspective, keep in mind that the White House, the presidency, didn't have a website until 1993. And even then, it looked like, well, this. I mean, this was the White House's website. You can get a quick little welcome message. The vice president, you can sign a guest book. Who does that anymore? You can take a look at some info about the first family. Look at that beautiful 8-bit photograph here that probably took 15 minutes to load. And more, all on the White House's website, right? That's the key here. Campaigns aren't going to have email lists until Howard Dean in 2004. 2004. That's about, a decade ago. Twitter, Facebook, and social media are going to change the way people can interact, and this is going to have a profound implication on media effects. And that's where we're going to stop here. And next time, in the next mini lecture, we're going to take a look at those effects. How is it that social media has changed? What does media do to influence you? So now we have kind of a background in that trajectory. We're going to move on and take a look at the political, psychological, and sociological effects of information.